In this lecture, I want to look specifically at Paul's conversion and how Paul understood conversion in general. First, let's try to pin down an approximate date for Paul's conversion. To do so, we first need to establish when Jesus died. Luke, in the Gospel of Luke, tells us that John the Baptist began his ministry in the 18th year of Tiberius Caesar. This might sound like a precise date, and it is. But regrettably, we don't know whether Luke thought that Tiberius's reign began in AD 12, when Tiberius became a colleague or associate of Augustus, in other words, when he entered the Collegia Imperii, or in AD 14, after Augustus died. If we go with the AD 12 date, then John would have begun his ministry in AD 26 or 27. If we go with the AD 14 date, he would have begun his ministry in AD 28 or 29. Okay, so we've got about a 2-year time gap, which isn't too bad, but it still isn't very helpful because we don't know how long John's ministry lasted before Jesus' ministry began. We only know that Jesus' ministry began after John's ministry, but it could have begun a few months after or perhaps a few years after. Another problem is that we don't know how long Jesus' ministry lasted. The famous historian Eusebius, in the 4th century, claimed that in the Gospel of John, Jesus is portrayed as having attended 4 Passover feasts. And from this, he concluded that Jesus' ministry lasted for about 3.5 years. Many interpreters have followed Eusebius throughout the centuries, even up to the present day. But his argument is somewhat naive. First, it assumes that the feast in John chapter 5, verse 1 was the feast of Passover. Second, it assumes that John, when he was writing his gospel, was trying to give us a strict chronological order of events. Both of these assumptions have been justifiably questioned by modern interpreters. In fact, if the feast in John 5:1 is not the Passover, and if the Passover in chapter 2, when Jesus cleanses the temple, was the same Passover that he celebrated just before his crucifixion, which is how the events are narrated in the Synoptic Gospels, then John's Gospel only mentions 2 Passovers, not 4. And Jesus' entire ministry could then be compressed into just over a year. On the other hand, it seems unlikely that Jesus' ministry would have only lasted for such a short period of time. So maybe it lasted 2 or more years. It couldn't have lasted for, decades or something like that, because he was crucified under Pontius Pilate, and Pilate's tenure ended in AD 36. Okay, so now, how does all of this information relate to our dating of Paul's conversion? Obviously, we aren't going to be very precise in our dates, but we can make some decent approximations. Paul was known as a persecutor of Christians, at least in the mind of Saul of Tarsus, in other words, the pre-converted Paul. Christianity was something of a threat to Orthodox Judaism. And there appear to have been significant numbers of Christians in various cities throughout Judea, Damascus, and elsewhere. These data imply that there had been some period of growth since the death and resurrection of Christ. Hence, Paul's conversion could have scarcely taken place any earlier than, say, AD 32. And that's if we date Jesus' death to be very early. But Paul's conversion could have occurred a few years later, depending again on when we date Jesus' crucifixion. As I said, it had to have occurred before AD 36. So Paul's conversion could have happened a few years after that, I suppose. Okay, so now we've established a terminus a quo and a terminus ad quem. We can say that Paul's conversion happened sometime between AD 32 and AD 39. But most historians would probably date it to sometime between these 2 extreme dates. Okay, now let's try to determine what exactly Paul experienced at his conversion. Was it a dramatic vision of the risen Christ, as Luke portrays it? Or was Luke just fabricating a story in order to explain how Saul, a man who was once so opposed to the Jesus movement, suddenly became one of its greatest proponents? How does Luke's account compare and contrast with what Paul tells us in his own epistles? Well, let's look first at Luke's version of what happened. In the book of Acts, the story is told 3 times. It's told in chapters 9, 22, and 26. The first account is told by Luke from a narrator's point of view. The other 2 accounts are told by Paul from his point of view. The account in chapter 22 is told before a Roman tribune and a hostile Jewish audience. The account in chapter 26 is told before the king Agrippa, as well as his sister Bernice and a procurator named Festus. These 3 accounts differ slightly, but this is often because they're being told for different audiences. We'll look more closely at each of these differences a bit later. Okay, so if we put these 3 accounts together, the story that Luke tells goes something like this. Paul was en route to Damascus with letters from the high priest and from those whom he calls the elders, that is the Sanhedrin, requesting that Christians in the city be arrested and brought back to Jerusalem, presumably in order to be tried and sentenced. Now, given the political situation, Paul would have undoubtedly needed more than the Jewish high priestly authorities and the Sanhedrin. He would have also needed to get the approval of the Roman authority in the city. So he would have probably tried to argue that these Jesus followers in the city of Damascus were causing social strife within the Jewish community, because they were promoting ideas and practices that violated Jewish law and custom. According to Greek and Roman law, a person or a group could often be prosecuted for what was called impiety, asabeia in Greek. Impiety was something akin to what we might think of as sacrilege. It was usually more than just immorality, although it wasn't always easy to define. Socrates, for example, was convicted of impiety because he allegedly introduced new divinities and denied the existence of the traditional gods. Others were prosecuted for impiety because they engaged in magical practices with an intent of causing harm to individuals or to society as a whole. Impiety usually had something to do with religion or one's beliefs about the gods or one's actions relating to the gods. And of course, within a specifically Jewish context, impiety would have included anything that seemed to violate the Mosaic law or Jewish customs. Christians would have been seen by Paul, in his pre-converted state, and by other Jewish authorities as having violated the Mosaic law because they were promoting the teachings of a false prophet or false Messiah. They would have therefore been deserving of punishment according to the legislation of Deuteronomy 13, at least by extension, due to their obstinate association with Jesus and their promotion of him as a true prophet or Messiah. So, as I said, Paul was en route to Damascus when he suddenly saw a bright light shining from heaven. It was the risen Jesus who called out, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" Now, in the third recounting of this story, the one in Acts chapter 26, there's an interesting detail that Luke adds. After Jesus says, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" he says, "It is difficult for you to kick against the goads." This proverbial saying would have been well known in Greek and Roman cultures, apparently. It shows up in the works of Pindar, Aeschylus, Euripides, and Terence. And some equivalent may have been known among Hebrew and Aramaic speakers as well. A goad was basically a spear. A farmer would use this goad to jab his ox or his mule if it ever stopped moving as he was trying to plow. If the animal were to kick against this goad, it could sustain quite serious injury. So what the proverb probably meant on the lips of Jesus was that by persecuting Christians, Paul was only hurting himself. Well, when Paul hears this heavenly voice, he asks who it is who's speaking with him. And Jesus responds, "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. But rise and stand upon your feet, for I have appeared to you for this purpose, to appoint you to serve and bear witness to the things in which you have seen me, and to those in which I will appear to you, delivering you from the people and from the Gentiles to whom I send you, to open their eyes, that they may turn from darkness to light, and from the power of Satan to God, that they may receive forgiveness of sins and a place among those who are sanctified by faith in me." Jesus then told Paul to go into the city of Damascus, where he would receive further instruction about what he was to do. After this, Jesus vanished, and Paul was left blind. The men who were with him then led him the rest of the way to the city of Damascus. At this point, the Lord appeared in a vision to another man named Ananias. This was a well-known and well-respected man in the city, and he was also a Christian. So Jesus instructed him to go and to heal Paul of his blindness, and to tell him that he was being sent to bear witness about Christ throughout the world. So Ananias did these things, and Paul was promptly baptized. Within just a few days, Paul began preaching about Jesus in the Jewish synagogues, arguing that Jesus is the Christ. In other words, he's the Messiah. So that's basically Luke's version of what happened. Now, Paul never tells us this story in his letters, at least not in so many words. But he does say that he had personally seen the risen Jesus, and that some kind of revelation had been given to him of God's Son. Well, some interpreters have argued that what Paul experienced was a private vision, not an objective sighting, as Luke seems to portray it. Note how Paul speaks here in 1 Corinthians 15:5. He uses the passive verb for seeing, he appeared. Or we might translate, he was made visible also to me. This kind of language was often used to describe visionary experiences, as we see in Acts chapter 16, verse 9, where Paul sees a vision of a man in Macedonia standing and beseeching him to come to Macedonia to help us. This wasn't a literal sighting of the man, but just a vision. Also, in the Septuagint, that is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the word ophthe, same word, is often used of visions and dreams or symbolic appearances of God, such as when he appears to Moses in the burning bush, or when he appears in the pillar of fire or the cloud of smoke. So it could be argued on philological or lexical grounds that what Paul thought that he experienced was not an objective sighting, but a subjective vision of Jesus. I think this is a pretty weak argument, though. There's nothing inherently special about the word ophthe. It's just the passive form of horao, he saw. True, it was often used to speak about subjective or purely mental appearances, like those that a person sees in visions and dreams. But it could just as easily be used to describe objective appearances. We see this, for example, in 1 Maccabees, Josephus, the Gospel of Luke, the Book of Acts, and I'm sure that if I took the time, I could find many other examples beyond just these. 1 Maccabees uses the term to speak about Judas Maccabeus and a detachment of soldiers appearing on the battlefield. These were clearly objective sightings. Josephus uses the term to describe the objective appearances of Herod and Agrippa. Luke uses it to describe the appearances of the resurrected Jesus, which the evangelist clearly did not regard as subjective visions. Luke also uses the term to describe Moses' appearance to his fellow Israelites in Egypt. He obviously wasn't thinking of a visionary experience here either. Indeed, Paul himself uses this verb in the passive voice to describe Jesus' post-resurrection appearances to the other apostles. Paul scarcely thought that Jesus' appearances to the 12 disciples and to James and to 500 others were subjective visions. I mean, how would 500 people experience the same vision all at once, as Paul describes the appearance? You'd have to imagine that 500 individuals all had the same vision of Jesus at the same time. It seems much more likely that Paul was thinking of an objective event. Furthermore, if all of these appearances of the risen Jesus were visionary, I don't see how Paul could have listed them as unique events, which is precisely how he characterizes them in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-7. And so, I don't see that there is any good lexical basis for taking Paul in 1 Corinthians 15:8 to mean that he saw a subjective vision of the resurrected Jesus. At most, the passive verb could perhaps be construed as a divine passive, if you're familiar with that concept. Notice the story that Josephus tells about a divine or supernatural apparition of angelic angels in the sky. Josephus clearly understood this to have been an objective appearance. It was something that everyone saw up in the sky. But the passive voice verb suggests that there was something divine or supernatural about this appearance. And so perhaps that's why Paul chose to use the passive form of this verb to describe the appearance of Jesus that he saw. It wasn't because the appearances were subjective, but because they were divine or supernatural. I'm not convinced, therefore, that this term ophthe implies that Paul thought that he had only received a subjective vision of the resurrected Jesus. Paul seems to have regarded his encounter with the risen Jesus as something no less objective and no less real than when Jesus appeared to Peter, James, John, and all the rest. This is implied by the fact that he grounds his own apostolic commission to preach the gospel in this encounter and not in some commissioning from Peter, James, John, or anyone else. You see, apparently one of the qualifications for being an apostle was that a person had seen the risen Jesus. In this respect, as I said, Paul regarded himself as no different from the other apostles. Okay, now a bit later I'm going to talk about some of the implications of Paul's claim to have been directly commissioned by Jesus. But for now, let's look at another text where Paul speaks of his commissioning. In Galatians 1, 11-23, he says a lot of interesting things. He says that his life had changed dramatically from what it had been, all because God had revealed his Son to him, so that he might preach him among the Gentiles. He seems to link this revelation of the Son with his calling to preach the gospel, and that accords quite well with what we're told in the book of Acts about Paul's encounter with the risen Jesus on the road to Damascus. Interestingly, he adds that this calling to preach the gospel was something that God had determined from his mother's womb, in other words, before he was born. This language is evocative of the prophet Isaiah, who said, quote, "From my mother's womb he has called my name." Note, too, how Paul speaks about how he, quote, returned to Damascus after receiving his commission and after taking a trip to Arabia. A return to Damascus implies that he had previously been in the city. And this, too, fits with Luke's account of how Paul had seen the risen Jesus just outside of Damascus and how he had gone into the city afterwards. Paul, in Galatians, says that after 3 years, he went up to Jerusalem and then went to Syria and Cilicia. And this accords with the narrative in Acts, where we're told that after Paul had been in Damascus for a while, he made a trip to Jerusalem, and then, leaving Jerusalem, he went away to Tarsus. To be sure, there are some other details here that are a bit more difficult to reconcile with Luke's account. Luke mentions nothing, for example, about Paul taking a trip to Arabia. By the way, Arabia wasn't quite what it is today. It encompassed a much larger region. You can see that on these maps here. Questions have often been raised by commentators about how early Paul made his first trip to Jerusalem in order to meet with the other apostles. In Galatians chapter 1, verses 18 through 20, he says that he didn't go to Jerusalem until 3 years after Christ had appeared to him. And when he did go there, he only saw Peter and James, and he only remained there for a short 15-day period. By contrast, in Acts chapter 9, verses 26 through 30, it sounds as if Paul had gone to Jerusalem sooner than this. It really depends on how one understands what Luke meant when he wrote, "when many days had passed," in verse 23. This could perhaps be taken to mean 3 years. It's definitely a longer period of time than the, quote, several days that he mentions in verse 19. Perhaps one could also posit that Paul initially spent several days in Damascus, and then went to Arabia for some unspecified amount of time, and then returned to Damascus for many days before going to Jerusalem. This would certainly fit with Paul's chronology, but it would require some speculation on our part and a filling in of supposed gaps in Luke's narrative. Okay, but what about this business about Paul only seeing 2 of the apostles in Jerusalem? Luke's account could be understood to mean that Paul saw all of the apostles. But this isn't exactly what Luke says. Luke only says that Barnabas brought Paul to, quote, the apostles. He doesn't specify which ones or how many. So Luke's account doesn't necessarily conflict with Paul's account in Galatians. Well, you may not be convinced that Paul's remarks can be so easily reconciled with Luke's version of the events in the book of Acts. I'm only offering some possible ways of reconciling these 2 accounts. But what about the apparent discrepancies within the book of Acts itself? Many have pointed out that if we compare the 3 stories about Jesus appearing to Paul on the road to Damascus in chapters 9, 22, and 26, there are some notable inconsistencies. The most obvious of these are the ones that I've highlighted here, and several of these, to me at least, don't actually seem like discrepancies at all. Did Paul receive his commission and his papers from the high priest only, or from the other chief priests, plural, and from the elders, that is, the Sanhedrin? Well, probably from all of them, but Luke only mentions the high priest in chapter 9 as a kind of shorthand. Paul's support from the high priest would have been the most important. So it would be kind of like a modern news reporter saying, "This bill has the support of the president." If the reporter were talking about a bill that had already been passed by Congress, there would have been no need to mention that it had the support of Congress, although in other contexts it might be appropriate to mention this. By the way, the New Testament often mentions chief priests. This phrase could also be rendered as high priests. Archieres is the Greek word. According to the law of Moses, there could only be one high priest at a time. So some scholars think that when the New Testament writers use the term in the plural, they are referring to the high priest and ex-high priests, or perhaps also to children of the high priest. Well, that was kind of the older view. I think the consensus now is that the New Testament writers were referring to the high priest and other high-ranking priests, including the captain of the temple, the director of the weekly course, the director of the daily course, the temple overseer, and the treasurer. Okay, well, how about the question of what exactly Paul's traveling companions saw on that day? According to chapters 22 and 26, they saw a light, but nothing is mentioned about this in chapter 9. We're only told that they saw no one in chapter 9. Well, but then Luke doesn't deny that they saw a light either, so this doesn't really seem like a contradiction. But here's one that's a bit more problematic, in the dark green. Who fell to the ground and who remained standing? In chapter 9, we're told that Paul fell to the ground while the others stood speechless. But in chapter 26, Paul says that everyone fell to the ground. In order to reconcile these two accounts, some commentators have suggested that the men initially fell to the ground, but then rose to their feet before Paul did. All right? And then probably the most difficult item here is marked in hot pink. Did the men who were with Paul hear a voice or not hear a voice? Well, if you happen to know Greek, you'll recognize that the word for voice in these two accounts is written in a different case. In chapter 9, it's written in the genitive case, and in chapter 22, it's written in the accusative case. According to J.H. Moulton, a grammarian, Luke was making use of a well-known grammatical distinction here, and was implying that in chapter 9, the men heard a sound, but it wasn't one that they could make any sense of. And so you might compare this incident with the one in John chapter 12, when Jesus prays and God answers him from heaven, and the multitudes say that they heard thunder. So on this interpretation, the men in chapter 9 heard something, but they couldn't make sense of it. But then in chapter 2, Paul heard an intelligible voice. Okay, and another attempt to reconcile these two texts proposes that the voice in chapter 9 was Paul's, whereas in chapter 22, it was Jesus. Okay, moving on now to another topic. It's sometimes argued that the traditional understanding of the yet unconverted Paul is incorrect. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, in the past, Saul of Tarsus, Paul the Pharisee, had often been painted as someone who labored his whole life under a guilty conscience, stricken with a deep sense of unworthiness before God, because he knew that deep down, despite his outward display of piety, he was not living up to God's rigorous standards of holiness. And so you might think of Paul in his pre-Christian state as someone like Martin Luther, laboring slavishly to win God's favor, but constantly failing in that effort, and then sort of beating himself up afterwards as a punishment. Here's a quote from Martin Luther. He says, "I was a good monk, and I kept the rule of my monastic order so strictly that I may say that if ever a monk got to heaven by his monkery, it was I. All my brothers in the monastery who knew me will bear me out. If I had kept on any longer, I should have killed myself with vigils, prayers, readings, and other work." Again, "I greatly longed to understand Paul's epistle to the Romans, and nothing stood in the way but this one expression, the justice of God, because I took it to mean that justice whereby God is just and deals justly in punishing the unjust. My situation was that, although an impeccable monk, I stood before God as a sinner, troubled in conscience, and I had no confidence that my merit would assuage him. Therefore, I did not love a just and angry God, but rather hated and murmured against him. Yet I clung to the dear Paul, and had a great yearning to know what he meant. Night and day I pondered until I saw the connection between the justice of God and the statement that, quote, the just shall live by his faith. Then I grasped that the justice of God is the righteousness by which, through grace and sheer mercy, God justifies us through faith. Thereupon I felt myself to be reborn and to have gone through open doors into paradise. The whole of Scripture took on a new meaning, and whereas before the justice of God had filled me with hate, now it became to me inexpressibly sweet in greater love." So those quotes kind of capture this idea of Martin Luther as a monk, slaving away in his piety, trying to earn God's favor, but then, constantly failing and falling on his face before God and realizing that he was hopeless. Well, against this way of understanding Paul, some commentators have pointed out that in the book of Philippians, The apostle says that before his conversion, he thought of himself as, quote, blameless before God because of how strict he was in his adherence to the law. So it sounds quite a bit different from what we have in the person of Martin Luther. Also, in Acts 26:5, Paul claims that as a former Pharisee, he lived, quote, according to the strictest sect of our religion, and mentions nothing about feeling a sense of brokenness for having not measured up to what God required. We can be quite sure, of course, that at conversion, Paul recognized that he had sinned grievously against God, at least insofar as he had rejected Jesus the Messiah and had zealously persecuted Christians. But it's not obvious that before conversion, he was sort of beating himself up over his own sinfulness. Okay, well, I think that there's a lot to be said about this newer way of understanding Paul in his pre-Christian state. Although I think we also need to realize that human psychology is complex. A person is often capable of feeling quite proud and quite broken at the same time. Prior to conversion, Paul does seem to have regarded himself as a model Jew, but probably in retrospect, he was able to be a bit more honest in how he had really felt deep down. Notice, for example, how he speaks of himself in Romans chapter 7. I realize that some people think that Paul was speaking here as a Christian rather than as a Pharisee, but I tend to think that he was just speaking as a human being, so his words would apply to anyone, whether a Christian or someone who is yet unregenerate. He says that he longs to live according to God's law in his inner person, but in his flesh, that is to say, in his sinful nature, he finds an opposing force constantly warring against him, causing him to do the opposite of what he wants. I have no doubt that Paul felt this inner struggle even before he became a Christian. In fact, he talks in Romans chapters 1 through 2 about how everyone will be judged according to his or her conscience. This kind of a warning would have no force if Paul thought that it would only resonate with, born-again Christians, or if he thought that it was possible for an unregenerate person to feel perfectly blameless before God. He seems to have recognized that at least on some level, every unregenerate individual knows that he or she is not truly blameless, at least not in God's eyes. Besides, there would have been plenty of biblical texts to encourage the yet unconverted Paul to assess himself a bit more critically. When the prophet Isaiah beheld God's glory, he cried, "Woe is me, for I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips." The patriarch Jacob confessed, "I am not worthy of the least of all the steadfast love and all the faithfulness which you have shown to your servant." And Solomon confessed that, quote, "There is no man who does not sin." In the book of Proverbs, he asks, "Who can say, I have kept my heart pure, I am clean and without sin?" And then, of course, there are all the other texts that Paul cites in Romans chapter 3. I suspect, therefore, that before his conversion, Paul was a bit bipolar. On one level, he would have felt quite satisfied with his religious achievements. Perhaps he congratulated himself, like the Pharisee in Jesus' parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. "God, I thank you that I am not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I get." But on another level, Paul probably had conflicting thoughts about himself. He must have had moments of deeper reflection when he thought about how his public persona did not match the reality. Truth be told, he was far from blameless. How many times had he coveted things that were not his? How many times had he spoken or acted in ways that were less than truthful? How many times had he committed a willful sin, something that the law of Moses refers to as a high-handed or presumptuous sin? How many times had he sinned inadvertently, but failed to make the proper atonement afterwards? And so on. Well, however Paul regarded himself before his conversion, at conversion, he obviously felt deep remorse and shame over his former way of life. In his epistle to the Philippians, he talks about how the things that he once thought were gain, he now counted as loss, or even as refuse. This doesn't sound like someone who was generally proud and satisfied about his former way of life. Among the things that he counts as refuse is his own righteousness, which he had attained by performing the law. Also in the book of Romans, he talks about how Christ showed his great love for, quote, us, in that he died for us while we were still sinners. Similarly, in the letter to the Ephesians, he says, "But God, who is rich in mercy, out of the great love with which he loved us, even when we were dead through our trespasses, made us alive together with Christ. By grace you have been saved." Presumably, Paul used the first person plural in these verses and not the second person plural because he meant to include himself. Again, in 1 Timothy 1:15, we read, "The saying is sure and worthy of full acceptance, that Jesus Christ came into the world to save sinners, and I am the foremost of sinners." I realize that the epistles of Ephesians and 1 Timothy are often thought to have been written by someone other than Paul, but the same cannot be said of Philippians and Romans. We'll talk in another lecture about the authorship question of certain epistles. To my mind, the issue is not nearly as clear-cut as many would imagine. Before his conversion, then, as I said, Paul was probably a bit bipolar about just how well he had measured up. Sometimes he thought of himself as blameless, an outstanding model of how a man ought to live. Other times he recognized that he, too, was a wretched sinner, in need of grace and forgiveness. And certainly when he converted to Christianity, he reassessed his former life and found it to have been an abject failure and worthless by comparison to the righteousness that he had now received through faith in Christ. Now, in this lecture, I've been referring to Paul as a convert, but some scholars feel that this terminology is either inappropriate or inaccurate. Some say that it's inappropriate because at this time there really wasn't a separate religion called Christianity. The followers of Jesus would have really just thought of themselves as Jews who were following the teachings of their promised Messiah. And other scholars feel that the terminology is inaccurate because what Paul thought that he experienced was a new calling from God. A calling isn't really the same thing as a conversion. Still others say that Paul simply had a profound visionary experience. Well, Alan Siegel offers 3 characteristics of a conversion, which I think can be helpful in the way that we understand Paul. First, with a conversion, the person recognizes that something had been lacking in his or her previous existence, and that this has been remedied by joining the new group. Second, the person restructures his or her reality according to the presuppositions of this new group. Third, the convert integrates his or her old perspective into the new one. If we understand conversion along these lines, then it seems perfectly appropriate and accurate to speak of Paul as a convert. Now, rather than saying that he converted to Christianity, some may prefer to say that he converted to the Jesus movement, and that's fine. I usually just find it easier to use the word Christianity. But of course, when I use that term, I don't mean to imply that Paul was converting to some entirely new religion. Okay, and Paul certainly believed that he had received a new calling on his life. We've seen that according to the book of Acts and according to the first chapter of the book of Galatians, Paul's new calling and his conversion seem to have coincided with one another. In other words, he received his calling at the time of his conversion, and I don't see why we need to regard calling and conversion as mutually exclusive ideas. As to the issue of whether Paul simply experienced a vision, I've already discussed why this view doesn't seem particularly convincing. All right, this leads us now to another question of how Paul understood conversion in general. In other words, not just what it meant for him to be converted, but what it means for anyone to be converted to Christianity. Paul invokes various metaphors to describe conversion. No single metaphor is probably meant to capture the experience entirely. Paul sees it as a kind of death to the old person and the old way of life that was characterized by sin, and a resurrection of sorts to the new person and the new way of life that is characterized by righteousness. We see this idea elaborated most extensively in Romans chapter 6, where he compares conversion to baptism. Just as Christ died and rose from the dead, so in baptism we die to sin and live to righteousness by God's grace. It's kind of interesting that Paul would use Christ's death and resurrection as metaphors like this. He clearly understood Christ's death and resurrection as historical events, but he also thought that they served as apt metaphors for what happens when a person becomes a Christian. Okay, and he says that at conversion, a person becomes a, quote, new creation, with old things passing away. The idea of repentance, that is, the renouncing of sinful practices, is obviously part of what he means here. And we can see this, for example, in 1 Corinthians 6. But there's also the idea that the person is somehow reborn or recreated, so that he or she no longer even desires to live as that old person. So it's not simply a voluntary decision to change one's way of life. You know, sort of like when you make a New Year's resolution, or when you give up something that you really enjoy for Lent. That's not conversion. That's just self-improvement, or striving to become more disciplined in life. At conversion, God takes the initiative, and God changes a person's very nature. Hence the metaphors of resurrection, recreation, rebirth, and regeneration. With conversion comes a change in desire and a change in attitude and perspective. Paul also speaks of conversion as a kind of deliverance or emancipation from the slavery of sin. But thanks to God, he says, that you, who were once slaves of sin, have become obedient from the heart to the standard of teaching to which you were committed, and having been set free from sin, have become slaves of righteousness. All right, so you don't become liberated in order to be just free to do whatever, but you're liberated from sin in order to become slaves unto righteousness. The key terms that Paul uses to speak about this deliverance or emancipation are ransom, apolutrosis in Greek, and the verb redeem, exagorazo. In the ancient world, a slave could either redeem himself or be redeemed by someone else if he paid the ransom price or the established price of redemption. So, on this metaphor, Paul envisaged Christ as paying the price of our redemption by dying on our behalf. Now, it's a metaphor, so don't start asking who exactly he had to pay off in order to secure our redemption. This was a common exegetical mistake that was made in the early church. There were some pretty elaborate theories in the early church about how Christ had to descend into Hades in order to offer himself up to Satan as the ransom price for all the souls that were in Hades. Satan very happily accepted this offer because he thought that he'd be able to keep Christ locked up forever with him in Hades. He didn't expect that Christ would be raised from the dead. So when Christ was raised from the dead, Satan's purposes were thwarted. I don't think that this is what Paul had in mind when he talked about redemption, but this is how a lot of early Christians understood the idea. Okay, and the last thing that I'll mention here is that Paul associates the conversion experience with adoption. We were formerly not members of God's family, but now God has adopted us into his family so that we can enjoy all the rights and privileges that come with being his sons and daughters. Now, Paul associates the conversion experience with several other things: reconciliation with God, forgiveness or cleansing from sin, justification, sanctification, and the receiving of God's Spirit. And each of these would be a topic unto itself, so I can't really elaborate on them here. But I do intend to talk about some of them at least in future lectures. Okay, now, I've already touched on this to some extent, but Paul stresses that his calling to be an apostle and his calling to preach the gospel were given to him directly from God. We see this in the openings to many of his epistles. For example, in 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Ephesians, Colossians, and 2 Timothy, he calls himself an apostle by the will of God. In 1 Timothy, it's by the command of God. And in Romans, he is an apostle by calling, obviously a calling from God. And in Galatians, he calls himself an apostle not from men or through a man, but through Jesus Christ and God the Father. To support this claim, he mentions that he had not even visited Jerusalem, where most of the apostles apparently resided, until some 3 years after he had already begun preaching the gospel. And he adds that he only spent a brief 15 days there, and he only saw the apostles Peter and James. And then in Galatians chapter 2, he sort of presents himself as Peter's overseer, saying that when he visited Antioch, he noticed that Peter was behaving in a way that was contrary to, quote, the truth of the gospel. Because of this, Paul says that he had to rebuke Peter in a rather public way. Peter was engaging in outright hypocrisy, and in so doing was putting the very message of the gospel at risk. The issue had to do with table fellowship. In other words, who one was allowed to eat a meal with. Peter appears to have had no problem eating with Gentile Christians, at least until, quote, certain men from James arrived there at Antioch. Whenever that happened, he would withdraw from the Gentiles and only eat with his fellow Jews, fearing what these men from James would think of him if he did otherwise. Paul found Peter's actions quite scandalous, because he was sending a message that unless a man is circumcised, he will always be of a lesser status within the church, less clean or less worthy in some way. Meanwhile, if a person is circumcised, he will be of a greater status in the church, more righteous and more worthy. To send this kind of a message, according to Paul, was to undermine the very truth of the gospel. Okay, and then another interesting thing that Paul does in Galatians chapter 2 is he says that his ministry to the Gentiles had been affirmed by those who, quote, seem to be something. In other words, by certain leaders in the church who were highly esteemed. These would have certainly included the apostles Peter, James, and John, but probably would have included other apostles as well, especially the ones who had been among Jesus' 12 disciples. Paul's language here is very interesting. When he speaks of these leaders as, quote, those who seem to be something, he's speaking derisively. He is tacitly questioning their revered status and authority, by further stating that these leaders added nothing to his own understanding of the gospel or his own authority to proclaim it. He was asserting his own independence vis-a-vis these leaders. In effect, he was saying that, as far as he is concerned, his commissioning and his understanding of the gospel were beyond the scope of any man to question, no matter what his perceived ranking in the church might be. To appreciate what Paul was doing here, imagine the Patriarch of Constantinople meeting with the Pope of Rome about some theological issue and saying afterwards, "Yeah, I met with the Pope about this issue. He seems to be an important church leader, at least in some people's opinion, but he didn't add anything to what I myself was already preaching, and besides, my authority doesn't rest on his judgments. So even if he had disagreed with me, it really wouldn't have mattered. He did agree with me, though, for whatever that's worth. Implicit in Paul's remarks in Galatians chapters 1 through 2 is the idea that the ultimate authority in the church is Christ, not some high-ranking human beings here on the earth. From this perspective, Paul was able to see his own apostolic calling and message as being no less authoritative than those of the so-called pillars of Peter, James, John, and all the rest. Such men may seem to be something, but in reality, they're just ministers of the gospel like Paul and Barnabas. They had no right to validate or invalidate Paul's calling or message because he received those things directly from Christ. And should these men ever step out of line by doing things or teaching things that were contrary to, quote, the truth of the gospel, he had every right to hold them in check. In fact, he tells the Galatians that they shouldn't even follow him if he should ever teach another gospel that was contrary to the one that they had been taught. According to Paul, then, no one ought to be followed out of some blind deference to authority. Note Paul's words in Galatians 2, verse 5. Here we can see that in Paul's way of thinking, it was far more important that the truth of the gospel be preserved than that some established hierarchical system be preserved. Paul's statement in Galatians 2:5 reminds me of another statement by a famous 4th century theologian named Gregory Nazianzus. This man had some interesting reflections on the doctrine of apostolic succession. I probably need to explain what I mean by that. Apostolic succession was the idea that a bishop must always be ordained by an earlier bishop who had himself been ordained by a still earlier bishop, and so on. A lineage of bishops can therefore be traced all the way back to one of the apostles, whom Jesus himself had personally ordained. That's what Christians mean when they speak about apostolic succession. It refers to a succession of bishops that can be traced back to the apostles. According to this doctrine, no one who claims to be a bishop is, in fact, a legitimate bishop unless he can trace his lineage back to an apostle like this. That is, through a physical transferring of orders from one man to another. The doctrine was probably invented at a pretty early stage to help Christians differentiate themselves from the many heretical groups that were cropping up in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. Interestingly, one of the earliest proponents of this doctrine of apostolic succession was Tertullian, and he recognized that in his day, many Orthodox churches were constantly cropping up, even though no apostolic succession had taken place. He says that these churches can still be regarded as apostolic because they follow in the teachings and practices of the apostles. So that really goes against the kind of rigid way that many Christians have understood this doctrine over the centuries. Understood most rigidly, or univocally, the doctrine of apostolic succession made it practically impossible for anyone to start a new church without the approval of an Orthodox bishop. In many ways, the doctrine was helpful because it limited the spread of heretical movements and made it easier for people to distinguish Orthodox churches from unorthodox or heretical ones. But in other ways, I think that the doctrine was very harmful because it discouraged critical thinking and promoted an obsequious deference to authority. It encouraged many Christians to think that if someone had been properly ordained as a bishop, he needed to be unquestionably obeyed. Meanwhile, anyone who had not been properly ordained was to be shunned and assumed to be a heretic. And so, for example, we have this statement by Irenaeus, who was writing in the late 2nd century, and then this other one by Ignatius of Antioch, who was writing in the early 2nd century. He says, "Your bishop presides in the place of God." Well, if he presides in the place of God, then, you better obey him, right? Well, but thankfully, other Christians recognized the danger in this way of thinking. They knew from experience that apostolic succession was not some kind of fail-safe or guarantee of a man's orthodoxy. Gregory of Nazianzus, for example, reflected on Athanasius's replacement of an Arian bishop named Gregory of Cappadocia. Some people were apparently wondering how it was possible for a heretical Arian bishop to have occupied the same office as St. Mark. St. Mark was supposedly the first bishop of Alexandria. Apostolic succession, Gregory of Nazianzus says, means nothing if a bishop breaks with the, quote, unity of doctrine which the apostles had taught. In this case, such a man, quote, succeeds the apostle in the same sense as disease to health, darkness to light, storm to calm, and frenzy to sound sense. I think this statement by Gregory of Nazianzus is very much in keeping with Paul's statements in Galatians chapters 1 through 2. Now, Paul's willingness to think independently and to speak truth to power would be variously understood in later centuries. In the 2nd century, some of the so-called Gnostic groups pointed to Paul's rebuke of Peter as a justification for their new and secret doctrines. They claimed that Paul came along after Peter because Peter's teachings had been wrong or incomplete. By rebuking Peter, Paul was effectively imparting, quote, a fuller knowledge of the truth. The Gnostic teachers of the 2nd century envisaged themselves as acting like Paul in this respect. They were imparting a still fuller knowledge of the truth. Well, Tertullian had little patience for this line of reasoning. He argued that the apostles had all been given the same fullness of knowledge whenever Christ communicated his teachings to them. The apostles, in turn, passed this knowledge on to others, and did so publicly, not secretly. So in Christianity, there is no, quote, occult gospel that has been divulged only to certain elite teachers. Christ and the apostles spoke openly, without any suggestion of a, quote, hidden mystery. Hence, there is no need for a fuller knowledge, especially not from these Gnostic teachers who seem to have no qualms about contradicting what the apostles themselves had originally taught. The deposit of doctrine, as Tertullian called it, was perfectly complete, thank you very much. Christ commanded his disciples to proclaim from the housetops what they had been taught in private. And Tertullian goes on and on about this. I couldn't really fit everything that I wanted onto this slide, but if you want the whole argument, I would encourage you to read chapters 21 through 27 of Tertullian's Prescription Against the Heretics. Some of the church fathers found it inconceivable that Peter would have acted so hypocritically and that Paul would have publicly rebuked him for this. And so, for example, Origen, John Chrysostom, and Jerome all proposed that Peter and Paul were engaging in a kind of play acting in order to convince the Judaizers that circumcision was no longer required. The Judaizers, in case you don't know, were Christian Jews who believed that Gentiles needed to be circumcised and adopt other Jewish practices in order to be saved. According to Origen, John Chrysostom, and Jerome, these Judaizers would not have been open to a rebuke coming directly from the Apostle Paul because they already distrusted him. You see, because Paul had kind of a reputation as an antinomian, that is, as someone who taught that you didn't have to keep any of God's law. But when they saw him rebuke Peter, the esteemed disciple of Christ, and when they saw Peter accept this rebuke, they were more willing to embrace what Paul had said to him. So that's what Peter and Paul did. They were kind of play acting, as I said, at least according to Origen, John Chrysostom, and Jerome. Ironically, this interpretation doesn't clear Peter of hypocrisy. It just makes Paul an accomplice in his hypocrisy. Well, most of the other church fathers didn't follow this rather implausible line of interpretation. They recognized that Peter had indeed acted hypocritically and deserved to be rebuked by Paul. This was how the episode was understood, for example, by Tertullian, Cyprian, Cyril of Jerusalem, Augustine, Gregory the Great, and Ambrosiaster. Now, in the eastern branches of Christianity, and also in the West, especially during and after the Reformation, Paul's rebuke of Peter in Galatians 2 would often be cited as proof that the Pope of Rome should not be regarded as some kind of unquestionable authority. The Pope, you see, was thought to have been the successor of Peter, the chief of the apostles, and so in the West, many regarded him as the supreme bishop in the church, the only one with jurisdiction over the entire church. That wasn't how he was seen in the East, though. In the East, he was seen simply as a patriarch of the West. A patriarch, by the way, was a bishop who presided over a large region. They're also sometimes referred to as primates, because they often act like monkeys. Kidding. In Eastern Christianity, patriarchs were all seen as having equal authority. So as I said, the Pope was seen as the Patriarch of Rome and as having jurisdiction over a certain district, or patriarchate as it's called, in the West, but not as having jurisdiction over the entire church. And you can see that quite clearly here in this quote from Ignatius of Antioch. There were patriarchs in the East as well, one in Constantinople, another in Alexandria, another in Antioch, and another in Jerusalem. Their districts, or patriarchates, were seen as autocephalous, in other words, self-governing, not subordinate to the Roman patriarch. So this was how the church hierarchy was structured in the early centuries, although it's not exactly clear when certain bishops came to be seen as having greater authority over others. Designations such as archbishop, metropolitan, primate, patriarch, cardinal, pope, and so on almost certainly did not originate with the apostles themselves. Anyway, in the 21st century, there are many more patriarchates, or autocephalous archbishoprics, one in Cyprus, another in Russia, Bulgaria, Romania, Macedonia, and so on. These are all thought to be independent or self-governing, and their patriarchs are all thought to be of equal authority with one another. So again, that's very different from how the church came to be structured in the West, where the Pope was seen as the universal bishop, with a special chrism to lead the church infallibly. That concept of the Pope certainly predates the First Vatican Council, which took place in the late 19th century. But at that council, the Pope was finally dogmatically proclaimed as the universal bishop and as the final court of appeal in all matters of faith and morals, as well as in any other matters relating to church discipline and church government throughout the world. Notice how this doctrine was grounded in the notion that Peter was the chief apostle. Never mind the fact that Peter was also a bishop in Jerusalem and Antioch, and never mind the fact that he appointed successors in each of those cities before he ever became a bishop in Rome. Since he died in Rome, that somehow gave his successors at Rome a greater authority than his successors in other places. To me, none of this really makes much sense, but that's the doctrine of papal supremacy in a nutshell. All right, well, you can probably imagine how these two visions of church authority would clash with one another. And that's exactly what happened. Over time, tensions started to mount, and eventually the Pope's claims about having supreme authority over the church would become a pretext for major abuses of power and would ultimately contribute to a major schism between the East and the West in 1054. A few centuries later, the issue of papal supremacy would once again come to a head in the Protestant Reformation. And here I'd like to read a few comments on Galatians chapter 2 from both Martin Luther and John Calvin, two of the so-called magisterial reformers of the 1500s. First, from Luther. In this matter of Paul's rebuke, Peter did not only err in judgment, but committed great sin. And if Paul had not resisted him, all the Gentiles who believed would have felt constrained to be circumcised and to keep the law. The believing Jews would have also been confirmed in their erroneous opinion, namely that the observation of these things was necessary for salvation, and by this means they would have received again the law instead of the gospel, Moses instead of Christ. And then another quote, "Here you see plainly that Paul accuses Peter of hypocrisy. If Peter acted hypocritically, then he certainly knew what the truth was and what it was not. Any person who acts hypocritically sins not out of ignorance, but deceives by a deceptive ploy that he knows to be false. It is a remarkable thing to consider that God preserved the church when it was still young, and the gospel itself by just one person. Paul alone stood for the truth. Peter was against him, and Barnabas was lost. Paul then reproved Peter for no trivial matter, but for the greatest article of Christian doctrine, which by Peter's hypocrisy was in great danger. It is certainly a remarkable thing that such excellent men as Peter, Barnabas, and others should fall so quickly and so easily, especially in a matter in which they had previously affirmed and taught to others. It is a dangerous thing to trust in our own strength, for in whatever we think ourselves most secure, we may err and fall and bring ourselves and others into great danger." And then a quote from John Calvin, "Peter was one of the 12, the equal of the rest, and their companion, not their master." In the letter to the Galatians, for almost 2 chapters, Paul contends solely that he is Peter's equal in the office of apostle. Hence, he recalls that he came to Peter not to profess subjection, but only to attest their agreement in doctrine before all, and that no less grace was conferred upon him among the Gentiles than upon Peter among the Jews. Finally, he recalls that when Peter did not act faithfully, he corrected him, and Peter obeyed his reproof. All these things reveal either that there was equality between Paul and Peter, or at least that Peter had no more power over the rest than they had over him. Now, as I have already said, Paul expressly argues that no one may put either Peter or John ahead of him in the apostolate, for they were his colleagues, not his masters. All right, well, we could spend all day talking about how these 2 chapters in Galatians have been understood by Christians over the centuries, but I'll just have to leave it at that. Thanks for listening.